So we're looking at the concept of property and property rights. There are a lot of different theories of this. We've talked about this in relation to government, but now we're going to talk about it in relation to economics. So economics, remember, is a praxeology. It focuses on human behavior and human action based on incentives, and that humans, we have to interact in a couple of parameters of reality, which means we have to act within a world of scarcity, which means we can't satisfy all our wants and needs equally at the same time in the same relationship. We also work within a world of time and space, that however and whatever we do as humans, we are automatically interacting in a world of time and space. In fact, it's not really possible. It's possible kind of to conceptualize, but it's not really possible for us to even speak in a way meaningfully without concepts of time and space. That we interact with those, and we have a body and a mind, right? The physical part of us and the non-physical part of us that are grouped together, that distinguish us from other people. So, that being the case, all human beings universally have a concept of what is their own versus what is not their own. Not that it can't get adjusted or suspended or whatever the concept may be. There's different levels and layers of complication. But basically, that's kind of the concept of what we call property. And arguably, property starts with one common area of ownership, and that's our self-ownership over our own mind and own body. Meaning that we have the highest claim to the use and ownership of ourselves, our literal self, our body and our mind. Now, in those facts that we, of course, there could be some challenges to those things or questioning of those things. But if that's the case, that has implications for economic behavior, how people behave, how humans act, how people act with relation to what is their own or they perceive to be their own versus what is not their own. And even in areas where things are collectivized, there is still always the concept of mine versus somebody else's. For example, and this was actually Karl Marx, which is, remember, his whole Communist Manifesto, one of the points of that is, and kind of the central point of what he was saying, was the abolition of private property. Now, some people distinguish between private property and personal property, like your toothbrush or owning, owning land. Okay, but one person who was a Marxist, not Karl Marx, but someone else in that philosophical tradition made the point once that they tried to say that this sentence, very short sentence, they tried to say that property is theft. Tried to argue property is theft, that the ownership of private property is stealing from other people in society. But Karl Marx actually corrected that individual, even though he wanted to abolish private property. He actually corrected that individual by pointing out the logical contradiction in that short sentence, property is theft. He says property can't be theft because the definition of theft is stealing someone else's property. Therefore, it's a self-defeating statement. How can it be theft when theft is stealing the thing that you say is itself theft? And so it's kind of hard to get away from these concepts of property. So we usually end up arguing to what extent is property legitimate. For example, what we're going to look at later is the issue of intellectual property. We admit and we sympathize with the idea that people should have the credit due to what they create. For example, the EpiPen, great life-saving invention, which I have no problem with the inventors of it getting credit and becoming filthy rich from it. However, remember that it's not that simple, that EpiPen is owned by this wealthy company, Mylan, who has access to the state and can get the government to grant it special privileges and special permissions to be the only one legally to create and manufacture EpiPen. Therefore, it gets the government to create on its behalf a restricted marketplace, which allows Mylan to charge arguably more than it could otherwise charge on a free market. And it now has the agents of the government through the FDA to go after people inside the United States and outside the United States who attempt to create anything similar or the same as the EpiPen. So is it really legitimate that you can go to, if you meet the parameters and requirements, go to the government to have the government basically restrict other people from creating? So it's something to think about. On the other hand, we recognize plagiarism as unethical. Stealing other people's, we even call it stealing other people's ideas and not giving them credit. And so it's kind of complicated. But let's look at it at the more simple level. What is property? Property is the right to exclude. And I think that's the simplest definition of property that you can get. Thought about this for a while, because you could define property on with some other terminology, but I really think it comes down to one's right to exclude something from others. So for example, think of like my car. My car, I can I can use it. I bought it, paid for it. Okay, it is mine. It is not somebody else's. My neighbor can come to me to ask to borrow the car. I can say yes or I can say no, but it's up to me whether I want to do that. Okay, and the situation may be whatever it is. But I have a right to exclude others from the use of my property. That's kind of the concept of, at the most basic comprehensive level, of what property is. And it actually starts with, I think, it starts with the mind and body. I mean, and those concepts are together, so to speak of one, I mean, pretty much comes with the other. Just as people have a right to exclude, or should have a right to exclude from the use of their mind and body without their consent. They also have the right to choose how they use their mind and body in the physical world, in time and space. And so our existence, we exist in the world in time and space with our physical body and our mind. And we breathe the air and our hearts beat, and we need food and we need water and we need shelter and all these needs. We also live in a world of scarcity, which means our needs cannot all, and wants cannot all be met exhaustively. Therefore, we have to make choices and trade-offs. And if that's the case, we have to interact with the world in order to survive. We have to manipulate our physical environment in order to survive. You have to eat. You have to drink. You have to sleep, usually have some type of shelter or clothing. And all of those things take interacting with the physical environment, either literally itself or with other people who interact with the physical environment, and you trade with them. And this is the basis for what we call property, is that it comes from, I think property is an extension of self-ownership. That if you own yourself firstly and primarily, that in other words, you have the highest claim over your mind and body, higher than anybody else, and you get to decide how your mind and body get used interacting in the physical environment, then you have that self-ownership. But you also need to do things to continue your existence. So if person A goes to an apple tree and they eat the apple off the tree, as soon as they have mixed arguably their work, their labor, with the tree, climbing up it or whatever, or reaching up and grabbing the apple and plucking it off, as long as the tree does not belong to someone else, they haven't committed theft or fraud or coercion or something of that nature to get that, they have plucked the apple. And when they eat the apple, it kind of becomes part of them. It allows them to continue their existence, and the apple becomes their property. Same as with the idea of, okay, what if they need to cut down a tree and use space to maybe build a fire, build a house, something like that? They're mixing their labor with the physical world and manipulating it such that it's a different thing now. And that becomes their property. It becomes an extension of their self-ownership. So property is just, to a lesser extent, an expression of a person's self. In other words, if somebody steals my car, they put a gun to my head and say, I want to steal your car, and I give up my car. They've committed a crime against me. Now, they could say to me, hey, you know what? It's just stuff. At least you're alive. And that would be kind of true. But it would also ignore and be insensitive to the fact that having my stuff stolen was a violation of my self-ownership. And my self-ownership extended to the work and money that it took to buy that car. And so that would be theft, right? And so there are kind of ways of extending this, so it gets a little bit more complicated. This is what would make slavery ethically wrong. Slavery is the kidnapping of someone and the forcing of that person to do labor against their consent. It's the capturing of their body and forcing them to use their mind and body in a way that they otherwise would not, under the threat of violence or actual violence. It's what differentiates slavery from the free trade of labor in, for example, like a job. When somebody goes to work, they have made a voluntary contract to give up their time, the use of their mind and body in a particular way. They've given up what they value less in order to get something they value more. But they get to make that choice voluntarily and contract out the use of their mind and body in time and space in agreement with an employer. So that's what distinguishes slavery from work. I mean, work, slavery involves work too. That's what distinguishes slavery from employment, is this idea of self-ownership and property, the extension of self-ownership. So your employer doesn't own you, but they have contracted with you. You've given them part of yourself, your time, the use of your body and mind and time and space to do something particular for them in exchange for something that you want more, which is money. You've given up lower valued means to get to a higher valued end. Now, these things are made clearer by the idea of property. But, of course, it always gets more complicated than this. Next time, we'll talk a little bit more about these things, maybe talk about some things that get where property rights get a little bit more hard to define. Think of even like adoption. Adoption is an exchange. To put it in kind of adoption's a great thing, but to put adoptions in a different ethical category than slavery. Adoption is on average good, and slavery is obviously bad and criminal. However, adoption is the exchange of people and the surrendering of parental rights and the transfer of parental rights. And usually there's money involved, right? But that's not human trafficking. That's not slavery. But what makes that situation different from slavery or human trafficking that involves kidnapping someone and forcing them to labor against their will? Right? So it gets a little bit more complicated, but I think it starts here with this idea of self-ownership.